Good morning. I'm Michael Goldman, the Jewish chaplain here at Georgetown Law School. I am a graduate of Georgetown Law School as well. I'd like to welcome our visitors to the law school and everyone to this memorial service for Robert Haft, beloved professor to thousands of students during his tenure here. I'd specifically like to welcome his family, his wife, Sarah, daughters, Michelle and Mary, and sons, Arthur and Dave. The family has asked that we consider this service more a celebration than a sad occasion, and believe Bob would have approved. As we will hear, Bob left a warm and lasting impression here and made many friends among his colleagues and his students. We will begin the process of remembering him and what he meant to us. His memory is indeed a blessing. Dean Trainer would like to welcome you as well and add the memories of Bob that he has gathered. Dean Trainer.
Sarah, Michelle, Mary, Arthur, Dave. There's so much to celebrate. You know, Bob was a treasured member of this community, and for more than a generation, he was a beloved professor. And you'll hear from some of his colleagues who will reflect on their experience with Bob and how much he meant to them and how much he meant to all of us. What I'd like to do is to start by talking about the way he touched the students. And so we went back and we looked at the teaching evaluations. So I just want to put all of our current faculty on warning. And I have to say, I was just so struck by the way in which his warmth, his caring, his sense of humor was treasured. So let me read a few of the comments that I was able to gather in the last few days. I'm very glad to have had Professor Haft as a professor. I personally believe he's the best teacher I've had, not only at Georgetown Law Center, but in my whole life. Another, instructor was passionate, enthusiastic, and clear about the motivating factors and essential aspects of securities law. It was a pleasure to be in class and listening to his animated lectures. Clarified and distilled the confusing mess of securities law in a coherent and portable way. He has a good sense of the real world as well as a complete understanding of theory, and he's a good lecturer. Moreover, he is very kind. If all classes were engaging as this one, banning the use of laptops would be a non-issue. Professor Haft is what might be described as old school. He really developed the Socratic method. He is great to work with. He would not spoon feed us, but rather have us think and deal with the fact that answers are usually gray rather than clear cut. Next one. I think Professor Haft has a passion for securities law that's contagious. I've not previously had a professor who so truly enjoys teaching and enjoys what he teaches. Another. Great professor and person. Wish there were more like him at Georgetown. I should have done a better job editing these. Keeps things interesting in class, provides amusing comic relief, just makes class enjoyable. Would recommend Haft to everyone. Another, great knowledge, no nonsense, focused and fun. You're hilarious, one student wrote. Never lose your sense of humor. You are the first professor I've ever had to make a 3-hour class bearable. I truly enjoyed Professor Haft's teaching style. He was hilarious in a cynical and grumpy kind of way. And I always looked forward to attending his classes. Haft is the rock star of securities law. The best class at Georgetown. A good man. And I think, that captures, as a professor, it's everything that all of us dream about. He's somebody who taught the law, who taught the theory, who prepared his students for practice, who was humorous, who was kind, who was an educator in every deep sense of the word. So it was a treasure to have him in this community. He will be missed, and today we have the opportunity to celebrate him.
Thank you, Dean Traynor. Well, I have to say I feel great regret that I didn't have him as my professor. Who knows? I might have gone into securities law. The next speaker is Professor Jeff Bauman, please.
Michael, thank you. Friends, family, I'm so glad all of you are here. In trying to think what I was going to say today, I'm glad that the setting is to celebrate Bob, because as sad as his death is for all of us, when I started to think about sad stories, I don't have sad stories. I have a lot of very happy memories, and I think celebration is absolutely the appropriate way to think about Bob, and it is indeed what he would have wanted. My history with Bob goes back 40 plus years. When I worked on the first thing I did with Bob was to be on a continuing legal education program that Roy Shotland hooked us up to do. And it was, I don't know if it was a huge success or not, but I had a wonderful time, and I think Bob did too. And was followed up after later in Bob's career when my late colleague Don Schwartz and I recruited him to Georgetown. So if there is any fault to be found after you strip away all the tributes that Bill just read to you, we are responsible for having brought Bob to the school, and we've never had a minute's regret. Let me start in thinking about Bob with his family, because as much as anything, that was most important to him. He adored Sarah. I think that's not an overstatement. He truly adored her and would have done anything at any time, and did. It's a huge loss for her, and as well as certainly for his kids, but certainly for her and for him. There was nothing that he would not have done for her. And I think I've known the kids now forever, and David long before I met Michelle and Mary and Arthur a long time ago, and I've known David from the day he was born, or pretty close. And I think Bob saw his kids, whom he also adored, particularly as the years went on, as a chance to make up for an earlier part of his life, which was enormously successful professionally, but took away from his ability to be with them as they were growing up. And as the years went on, it was clear that more and more, both with his kids and with his grandchildren, that the ability to spend time with them, to travel, to see them, was of fundamental importance. And David, who was younger than all of them by a good poke, David, what he did with David, I could not have done, I don't think. That is, he, at the age of in his 40s or 50s, he went camping. He camped out at a camp event with Dave in the tent, and the whole thing on the ground. Those of you who know Bob, who knew Bob, that's not the image that immediately comes to mind. So, what can I tell you? Bob had an unmatched joy of life for life. Anybody who has ever spent any time with him realized how much he grabbed on and would not let go. There was nothing that he wanted to do that he wouldn't allow himself to do, whether it was concerts or travel or food. That it was great fun traveling abroad with Bob, because if there was a great restaurant in France that took reservations 3 weeks from next Tuesday at 4 o'clock in the morning, Bob would be on the phone making those reservations. And the food was always good. But he didn't understand why we didn't all want to do that all the time. If you suggested to him that maybe you just wanted to have a nice quiet, that was also not Bob. And how come we weren't going to go to Chicago to hear Renee Fleming sing in a Handel opera and come back the next morning? How come we weren't going to do that? There was no such thing for Bob as downtime. He had the ability, to me, unmatched. I've never, unmatched is an easy word to say. I've never seen anybody whose mind was as precise, as copious as Bob's. That he had the ability, I would kill to be able to have this. He would read a book, listen to music, whatever it was, and remember it all. There was nothing that eluded him. He would be an expert witness in a major complex securities fraud case, and the law firm that retained him would send 20 boxes of documents and that showed up on the front lawn. And Bob would read them and remember every document, every fact, everything. It was amazing. I couldn't possibly do it. I can't remember, where I had dinner 2 nights ago. But Bob was able to process that. He would listen to music. Again, this is something I would love to. When we all put on CDs or whatever format, I think for most of us, it's background music. For Bob, there was no such thing as background music. Bob listened and he understood. He had a profound knowledge of music and conveyed it. And for him, as with everything else he did, it was all very intense, a lot of fun, and he was shared it with all of us. He cared deeply about all of you. You're all here today for a number of different reasons, but Bob cared deeply about every one of you. For him, friendship was a very, very important part of his life. We were lucky, I think, to be his friends. And as sad as his death is, I think we are all the richer for having shared part of his life with him and having him been a part of our lives. I want to end with the toast that I've heard Bob give many, many, many times at dinner parties. He would lift his glass with whoever was there and he would say, "Good health and good friends." And that was what mattered to him. We will miss him, we love him, and thank you all for being here.
Not only am I sorry that he didn't have his professor, I'm even more sad I didn't have him as a friend. Sounds like a wonderful person. And speaking of friends, I'd like to have Professor Michael Gottesman come up and speak about Bob.
When I was thinking of leaving practice after quarter century and coming to law school, I had doubts about that. Everybody I talked to said, "You've got to talk to Bob Haft. He's the one person at Georgetown who had precisely that career arc, a long period of practice and then entering academia." And so I called Bob. I had never met him, and we agreed to have lunch. That lunch turned out to be one of the most pivotal moments in my life. It's not just that he persuaded me that it's possible to have a second career that you love just as much as the first, and he had loved them both. It's that that was the beginning of a 30-year friendship that was as close as any friendship that I've got. Bob and Sarah and Roberta and I became very fast friends. We traveled all over the world together. Germany, France, Italy, the West Coast, up the Hudson Valley. We socialized all the time. Bob was a great storyteller. He didn't tell me stories about his securities practice because he doubted correctly that I would understand the complexities of the triumphs that he had achieved. But he did, at that very first lunch, he told me a story about one client that he thought I could understand, and that was Timothy Leary, the famous psychologist who spent a lifetime preaching the therapeutic value of taking psychedelic drugs, and who had understood that value from personal experience over and over and over again. Timothy Leary had many brushes with the law. He was convicted of a crime, and the case was appealed, and Timothy Leary came to Bob to represent him in the Supreme Court, arguing that case. And Bob did indeed, at the Supreme Court, present the argument in Leary's case. And as he was done and he was turning to leave the podium, the lawyer who was due to argue the next case, which involved a very similar issue, said to him, "That was fabulous. Would you be willing to argue my case as well?" Bob actually knew something about that case because it was similar, and he knew it was going to be argued the same day he had read the briefs. And Bob did what no sensible person would do unless they had extraordinary courage. Bob said he'd be delighted to argue this other case as well. And so he did, and this is what he told me at that first lunch. And I confess, I thought this couldn't possibly be true. This is some kind of embellishment. So when I got back to my office after that lunch, I did a little research. And I went into 395 U.S. reports. That's where the Supreme Court decisions are dutifully reported in full text. And I found Timothy Leary versus the United States. And sure enough, representing Timothy Leary was Robert J. Haft. And then at the end of this 50-page opinion, I saw the next case, United States v. Covington. And sure enough, it said Robert J. Haft, by special appearance, was represented. Robert J. Haft had not been on any of the briefs in that case. The court has this little, all the justices have this little thing in front of them telling them who's going to be arguing that day. And Robert was only arguing one case, but here he is up for a second. And the lawyer who was supposed to be arguing that case moved for permission from the court to have Mr. Haft present his argument. So Bob, I learned from that experience that Bob was a person of total honesty. When he told you stories that had to be embellished, they were in fact the true story. What was amazing about that experience is he had argued two cases in one day. Very few private lawyers ever have had the opportunity to argue two Supreme Court cases in one day. Fewer still argued two and won them both, as Bob did on that occasion. And I'm quite sure that in the history of the Supreme Court, this is the only occasion in which a lawyer entered the building intending to argue one case and emerged having argued two. So that was one of 1,000 Bob Haft stories, and I'm not going to go to others, but I will talk about other qualities that over our 30-year friendship I learned to appreciate. He was fiercely loyal to his friends and to people who he didn't know, but who he admired. You could not say anything negative about a friend. The most trivial piece of gossip would be met by what I call Bob's Bronx stare. He had grown up in the Bronx, and he could give you that look which meant, do not go further. And that's what we would get when we tried to say something about a friend that was other than totally totally appreciative. He was, as Jeff said, totally devoted to Sarah and kids. One of the other stories he told me early on was how he and Sarah did not know each other, but were sitting next to each other. I don't know whether it was a concert or a show. The opera, very fitting for Bob. At the opera, and Bob, being a very gregarious, if I had had a beautiful woman sitting next to me in the opera, I would not have met that person during that event. This was never a problem of Bob's. And Bob told me that, I value so much the lunch I had with him 30 years ago. Imagine how he valued the experience of meeting Sarah on that occasion. He was totally devoted to her and to his kids in everything that I saw. He was obviously an amazingly gregarious person. When we traveled on trips together, Roberta and I think Sarah as well, were kind of shy about meeting new people. That was never a problem, right? We knew everybody in the room the minute we walked in, because Bob had met them all in 30 seconds. He was a totally fun-loving person, as Jeff suggested. He had amazing energy. Even as he got older, he had amazing energy. And that was evident to me 13 months ago. Just 13 months ago, he had a birthday party for Sarah at their home. And he had invited everybody to come in costume. And Bob had decided to be a lifeguard. So he was there in swimming trunks and a lifeguard shirt and a lifeguard cap with a whistle in his mouth. He was bouncing around, full of energy, the life of the party. This was his 86th year. I don't know where he got that energy. I didn't have it in my 56th year, but Bob had it right up to that point. Sadly, it was very shortly after that party that his illness began. So he had been a huge figure in my life and in Roberta's life, and his passing has left a gigantic hole, as I'm sure it has to many of those here today. I try to fill that hole by remembering Bob the lifeguard. It was such a wonderful experience. It was not so very long ago, he was bubbling with life. He'll be sorely missed, but he's easily remembered.
Thank you, Professor Gottesman. So sorry I didn't have as a teacher and as a friend. And I was involved in some legal arguments where I could have used his expertise. I like the idea of just turning to the side. You did a great job. Could you take mine? Wow. The next speaker is his son, Arthur. Arthur, would you come up, please?
Good morning. Had an opportunity to speak at my brother's funeral a few years ago, and then my mother's funeral about 11 years ago, and wasn't hoping to have this opportunity all that soon. But I'm going to speak a little bit about my dad from the perspective of a son. Here we go. I hope no one finds this item too lengthy or boring, but this is a son's eulogy to his father. Who was Robert Haft? Who was Bob Haft? Bob Haft was my father. Sorry. In the only world I know and in which I have lived, Bob Haft is my father. He's been my father so far for 58 years, and I love him. Born in early 1959, I recall the first years of life growing up in Westbury, Long Island. This period was long before Central Florida did a job on my Long Island accent. My one father taught me to swim at Jericho Country Club. If it was Saturday in 1963, 1964, 1965, 1966, Dad was likely taking my older brother, Barry, younger sister Michelle, and me somewhere. But where? The Bronx Zoo, the New York Aquarium, Coney Island, the Empire State Building, museums, parks. At the Bronx Zoo, we sat atop camels for camel rides. If it was Friday night, Barry, Dad, and I would throw a baseball on the side of the house because Dad had taught both of us how to throw, how to catch. When we were with Dad, we could expect to see lions and tigers and bears because his world and the world we saw was built on a grand scale. We didn't need to behave dramatically because drama was in the cards. We lived a rarefied script with Bob Haft. Each night before bed, each of us, 3 children, separately had a story read to us. Then we would have what was called a quote-unquote sleep. We could ask questions about almost anything in the world during the sleep, a question-answer format. I remember some particular questions I asked at age 9 during one such question-answer session at bedtime. I thought the answers were disgusting, and I said at the time to my dad, but his answers turned out to be right, so much so that my daughter, his granddaughter Emily, is here with us today. Lucky for Dad, the question-answer sessions at bedtime didn't persist after age 9. After years on Long Island, our family of 5 moved to Manhattan for a year in 1968, then out to Scarsdale for a time. In Manhattan, we rode bikes in Central Park again on Saturdays and took long walks throughout the city. We could ride bikes because Dad taught Barry to ride a bike, taught me to ride a bike, and he may have taught Michelle how to ride a bike. However, Michelle can't remember who taught her to ride a bike. I'll let you know if she does remember. Later, Dad taught Dave to ride a bike. Dad and my mom stressed our being independent, so I recall the lone sojourn in Central Park at dusk, the hikes down windy streets to get to the public library. When I was 10 years old in 1970, my parents, Rosalie Haft and Bob, divorced. If the world hadn't labeled this event dysfunctional in 1970, we children would have thought it fine. Dad saw us way more. He was very attentive. What kid doesn't like that? Life was fine. Each Sunday of my life, pretty much on time, Bob Haft's phone call would ring through. There were standard questions about school, jobs, everyone's health, and this carried on way into my 50s. Everyone's health, then the free-for-all portion of the call. These calls continued until recently. My half of the family lived in Florida as of 1972. Dad insisted I visit New York and later Washington every school vacation I had. My 2 siblings often joined on these trips. I'm proud to say Bob Haft is my father. He sent me some good books to read. Only later did I wonder if he had actually read each book he sent at any time. Well, it didn't matter. I cannot recall any book he sent me that had no impact, whether it was James Michener's The Bridget Ann Dow or Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s Slaughterhouse-Five. The books he sent me packed a punch. He heartily brought me up to New York from Florida to work at his law firm in the summer of 1976 and 1977. He was proud to have his son with him all summer in 1976 and insisted I be with him most of the time as he cultivated his new relationship with one Sarah Haft, whom I had just met at age 16. He was crazy about Sarah, as you all know, and remained so for the next 42 years. Dad was ecstatic about all 3 of his oldest children attending Georgetown Law Center, where we are today. Each of us graduated and moved on into our careers. My brother Barry, in fact, became a securities lawyer like his father. David Haft, his son with Sarah, and his 4th child, was the only smart one. He studied computer engineering at Rochester University. He knew a storm when he saw one. Dad's life wasn't pure charm, even if he told you it was. In his present home in Bethesda, any guest could see around the kitchen table a shrine of photos, a temple dedicated to my brother Barry, who passed away in 1998 after a months-long battle with pancreatic cancer. Bob's oldest son stripped of existence at age 40, leaving his wife Mary behind with a 10-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter. Some people will tell you everything happens for a reason. I think Dad felt as I do that this tragedy happened for no reason at all. More than anyone, Dad knew that the narrow difference between those who go insane or fall justifiably into wells of bitterness after such cruel, senseless happenings and those who live on with purpose. Dad focused tenfold on the things he loved after Barry's death. In Dad's case, and those of you who knew him well would surely agree, the answer was to continue to pursue life on a grand scale. Knowing life was finite, he lived it as if it was infinite. Because Bob Haft refused to acknowledge obvious limitations, he lived the limitless life as he understood it. Dad lost his own mother, with whom he was close, at age 23, and his father passed away when Dad was 31. At age 58, I stand here having lost mother and father too, and I wonder how my dad felt to be without a parent at age 31. Well, he lived on a grand scale. He would tell you that Nathan's on Coney Island had the best hot dogs in the world. This is the son's eulogy to his father. I wondered where he found the time between trips to far-flung corners of the world to seemingly memorize all the notes of the countless classical music and opera CDs in his basement. I still wonder. 7 months ago, I sat with him in a Bethesda movie theater watching part of Don Giovanni after our movie Across the Hall was over. Dad knew every line, every note, even as his memory may have slightly faded in other ways. He was vital. It was a slice of heaven. Then he went out in the theater hall and ate 2 hot dogs for dinner. Into adulthood, I could call Dad concerning any type of problem, apart from the regular Sunday calls I would receive. And if he didn't know the answer, he faked like he did. Kidding aside, he could talk with you about your own problems, not his own, like nobody else. He wanted to provide all the answers because he cared about you, felt obliged to offer the possible cure when none appeared yet on the horizon. This because Dad had the big heart, cared about you, and you knew it. In his dream world, I'm so very glad he only saw admission for the first time to a hospital at age 85, just before his 86th birthday. After becoming weaker over the past year, Dad maintained his sense of humor, and I found him to be a pleasure to be around. The most outgoing guy in the world had been saddled and handled it with grace. His quixotic core remained intact. This is the son's eulogy to his father. I was honored to care for him on several occasions, to give his dedicated wife a respite. No one could have cared for my dad better than Sarah did. It was upon Dad's first hospitalization that I realized Sarah's competence to care well for Dad. There may be some equals out there, but no one better. That she trusted me to care for Dad in blocks of time so she could have several days off meant so much. And she took care of Dad for a year devotedly, straight, without a tremendous amount of assistance. She was pretty much a saint in this regard. Each aspect of his care was part of her being. After her tutorial on the many aspects of his daily care, I felt well prepared indeed to enjoy the company of my dad for days on end, unaware of how many more times I would be blessed with that company. So I want to thank Sarah for permitting me to aspire to the level of care we all deserve, the level my dad had as he reached the finish line. These will be prime memories for me, and those who don't understand simply will not understand. Dad won this race, we all know. And if a man is measured by the level to which he inspired others, those around him won the race too.
Thank you, Arthur. This is so moving, such a moving celebration. I'd also like to invite up his son, Dave, to continue the talk.
First, I'd just like to thank everyone for being here. It means a lot to me. I hope being here for yourself also is meaningful, is healing, and allows you to take some time to remember my father. Life has a funny way of reminding us that it is precious, that it is fleeting. My father knew that and embraced life as much as anyone can. He loved oh boy, did he love. And I see that. I hear that every day when I interact with my own daughter, whom he spent so much quality time with over these past 5 years. I hope that each of you, when you feel love from others in your life today that are still alive, that also reminds you of the love that I'm certain that he offered you. He and my mom met in an interesting way, and I wanted to just share that story with you. They were in New York, strangers passing, I'm sure, just miles, feet from each other over the years that they lived there. One day, my mom had an opportunity to go to the opera. She worked in the arts. There was an empty seat. It happened to be next to my father. And conversation ensued. So he picked her up. He asked her, "Are you free? Are you free as a bird?" The name of the opera was The Force of Destiny. He went skydiving. He went on the Concorde, a plane that doesn't even exist anymore. He loved technology, and I shared our fascination of science, engineering, thought with him. And for that, I will always cherish him. That's really all I wanted to share with you. I wanted to keep it brief and just let you know that I appreciate you. Even in his final days, he was so gracious and thankful for my presence, everyone else's, everyone who took the time, anyone who sent a message in recent years, or quite frankly, over his lifespan. He really loved everyone, he loved life, and he was so thankful to have you in his life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. In case anybody isn't aware, Dave is the reason we're going to have a lot of the videos and music and so forth that will be here. So it's continuing this legacy of technical knowledge and prowess. So we'll see that. I'd also like to invite up his longstanding friend from at least teenage years, Marty Rabinowitz.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Sarah for asking me if I would say a few words because it enabled me to reflect on many years of friendship with Bob. I first met Bob in Paradise, not Lowe's Paradise in the Bronx, a great movie theater, but a scruffy bungalow colony and camp in Putnam County, New York called Peekahole, an ancient Indian name standing for Peekskill Country Homes. There, two boys from the Bronx thought it was paradise. We were both camp counselors, Bob living in the decaying old farmhouse known as the counselor house, and I at my parents' cottage in the colony. Bob had just completed his sophomore year at City College, the creme de la creme of the New York City College system, which was then free, totally free. And I had completed my freshman year at Columbia College. Both of us were Bronx boys in the days of the good old Bronx. This means we played in the streets, stickball, stoopball, and even football in the street, with baseball and basketball in the schoolyards and parks. We were educated in the New York City public school system, which then provided an excellent education. The city was extremely safe, permitting us to travel to Manhattan by the subway at ages of 11 or 12 without any parental concerns. With his Bronx and college background, we were pre-cleared to be soulmates when we met in 1950 at Pico. Bob was then a thin, wiry guy who had an ever-ready smile and a slightly sarcastic sense of humor. In later life, he liked to remind me from whence I came by saying, "How you doing, Butchick?" He was in charge of the senior boys at camp, a bunch of 15 or 16-year-olds who thought they were tough but went home for lunch and slept in their own beds. Bob whipped them into shape quickly and was, as he was here, extremely popular with his campus. As a group, the counselors were all college students or graduates. We all leaned to the left politically and sat around the council house porch singing folk songs, labor union songs, vaguely communistic songs. There was no TV, no internet, no cell phones, and no air conditioning, requiring us to make our own fun, which consists of talking and talking about everything under the sun, and Bob often led the political debates, demolishing all opponents. I forgot to tell you one of the main reasons that Pico seemed to be paradise. It was co-ed. City College and Columbia College were all male. Love was in the air and we breathed it in. Early in the season, the camp director complained that residents had seen women in the men's portion of the council house and asked what we would do about it. Bob suggested he get better window shades. Before long, people paired off. 5 or 6 of us actually were paired with a girl that we eventually married. Extraordinary for a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds. Most of us remained friends for many years thereafter, enjoying dinner, theater, and ballet in the $1.80 cheap seats in the theater in New York in those days. Paradise was great, but the real world beckoned. Soon enough, we graduated college. Bob, always a top student, went to Columbia Law School, and I followed a year later. As he was a year ahead of me, I bought all of his used textbooks with his marginal notes. One day, one of the toughest professors asked a question that was impossible to answer. I rattled off a perfect answer, astonishing him. He was so astonished he asked me if I had discussed it previously, and with a first-year student or a second-year student. I knew what he meant. As one of the brightest, Bob was selected for the Columbia Law Review. No, not only was it important for prestige and the ability to work with top students in the law school, but in those days it was essential to getting a job with a top firm. You would not be hired unless you were on the law review of Columbia, Harvard, Yale, or Stanford, possibly Michigan, at least in New York, that was the rule. And unless you had some connection to a relative, you would not be hired. Suddenly the dress code changed from Bronx collegiate to Wall Street conservative, and Bob appeared in suits with vests and ties. Bob's first job was a clerk to District Court Judge Irving Kaufman, who had presided over the Rosenberg case. I wonder what would have been the case if Bob had been there before he tried the case. Perhaps he would have knocked some sense into it. He then moved to Goldstein, Judd and Gerfine, a small firm, but Goldstein has been the Attorney General of New York. Judd was the Solicitor General, and Gerfine was Counselor Dewey. And I think 2 of them were magna cum laude at Harvard. So he was up with tough competition. Early on, Bob was sent to get a continuance in a divorce case for temporary alimony for a very important client of Judd who was in Europe. Judd insisted that he postpone it at least until Judd returned, hopefully longer. Rothenberg got up and said, Rothenberg was a famous bomber lawyer in New York. He was one of the leading bomber divorce lawyers. And he got up and told the judge his client that had no support, and the judge wrapped his gavel and said, hearing this afternoon. Bob thought his job was going to be disappearing. So he jumped up and said, Judge, Mr. Rothenberg is a liar. And the judge said, what did you say? And Bob proceeded to tell him that his client had got this many dollars and that many dollars over the last 6 months. Judge turned to Rothenberg and said, I'll never believe anything you say again. Hearing set for 6 months. So early on, he was a practical solution lawyer. Ultimately, the firm's practice moved into SEC work, principally new issues, and Bob was the expert therein. He led that practice. He became a specialist in the new issues market, and in those days, you were able to participate in the success of your clients, so Bob had a financial success from that as well. Soon thereafter, he opened a law firm with Howard Stamer. Bob being modest, it was called Stamer and Haft. And at some time, I don't recall how it came to be, but he and Stamer represented Bernie Kornfeld, a name most of you don't know, but Bernie Kornfeld led one of the great financial scandals of the era. He was a bright young man with a brilliant idea. He was going to sell mutual funds to servicemen in Europe. His firm didn't like it, so he did it himself, calling it Investors Overseas Services, IOS. It soon was prospering big time and not following any of the Securities Act rules, and ended up with Bob, first time ever, having a hearing before the full SEC commission. You can guess who won. The result was that Kornfeld was entitled to continue his business so long as he didn't sell to anyone in the United States, and Bob essentially preserved his business for him. Kornfeld was grateful, and Stamer and Haft continued to represent them for quite a while. Now, Kornfeld ran a pretty wild group of salesmen and showered them with all kinds of perks. He lived like a king, and he liked his lawyers to live like kings too. So Bob and Howard would arrive in Geneva. Each would have their own limousine. Each would go to their own top suite in the top hotel. Each would go to whatever great restaurant they wanted to, and had a really wild living time. Ultimately, Kornfeld's excesses brought him down, and Bob and Howard continued their securities practice, perfecting his Blue Sky Handbook, and ultimately, as we heard, coming to teach at Georgetown. Bob and Rosalie were first in the group to get married, first to buy a house, first to move from the suburb to the city, and first to move back to the city and back to the suburbs again, all the time raising 2 sons and a daughter. Bob's first home was one of 300 identical homes built in Hicksville, Long Island. Arthur was raised in Westbury. I'll tell you why in a minute. When buying the home, Bob was so engaged with details and asked so many questions that the builders stopped saying hello when he picked up the phone. He said, "What next, Mr. Haft?" Out there with 300 identical homes, there were all kinds of campaigns to do this and that. Someone knocked on Bob's door and said, for a small fee, the postmaster will change Hicksville to Westbury Post Office. Bob said, what does he want for Great Neck? And I'm missing a page. No, I have it there. I have another copy. Anna, you want to give me that envelope? So all of that was fun for people who didn't know the young Bob Haft. But I can never capture the Bob who was my friend for 67 years and whose memory I cherish. Bob was always so full of life. He lived, as you all know and have heard, to get the most out of every moment. He rose to every challenge, both personal and professional, and in doing so, he inspired others to do the same. He, he, he was the cause of Anna and I getting somewhat serious about classical music. In fact, he gave me my first list of must-have records, and in other words, he curated my first collection of 78 LPs. Sarah told me that even if Bob and I had not seen each other for quite a while, we always picked up as if the conversation had paused for just a minute. I guess that's the essence of true friendship. I had a partner who was fond of saying, "You're immortal until you die." But I think Bob, looking at all the people in this room and their relationship, lives on. Thank you.
Prayer traditionally said, the prayer traditionally said for the deceased is the Kaddish, which can be found in your program. I understand that Bob himself often looked for occasions to say Kaddish in memory of his beloved son Barry, who we heard passed away at much too young an age. What is surprising about this prayer is that it makes no mention whatsoever of death or even mortality. It simply repeatedly praises God. The usual explanation is similar to that of the request of the Haft family that this is about the celebration of life. Despite Bob's death, despite all the losses, life, existence, God, all are still praised and affirmed. We do not need to be reminded of our sadness or our loss. On the contrary, we need to remember the goodness, and as we have today, the memories that remain and sustain. Indeed, the tradition believes that God, him or herself, has also experienced a loss. God's world, like ours, has been diminished. Bob's loss is felt even by the divinity. So the Kaddish praises God to provide comfort for Bob's loss, to help God begin the healing process towards wholeness. We're not alone in our loss or suffering, and that I hope is a comfort. So I'd ask that you, those who want to stand for Kaddish, which I will recite and people can join in if they would like. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, v'yomad yivarach chirotei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael, ba'agala uv'yizman kariv v'imru, Amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam omei umayom. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal, Shemei Dekudashah Barechu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechemata. Da'amiram b'yomah v'imru. Amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya. V'chayim alenu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav. Hu ya'aseh shalom. Alenu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. May God who makes peace in the heavens also bring peace to all of us in this world. Amen. One final announcement. As there's slips of paper on the tables, visitors will be welcomed at Sarah Haft's home tomorrow, Friday and Saturday, between 3 and 7 p.m. The address is on those slips of paper. Thank you very much.